I thought I knew pain, I whispered to myself, my voice trembling as the words echoed in the quiet of my apartment. But this is different. It all began in his living room, a room that once felt like home, now suddenly cold and foreign. The air smelled faintly of sandalwood, the cologne he always wore, and yet it made my stomach churn. He stood there, his hands clenched into fists as if trying to anchor himself. I sat frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for him to say something, anything that would make sense of the words he had just thrown at me. "Rosanna," he repeated, as if I hadn't heard him the first time. We can't be together anymore." I stared at him, unblinking, trying to process the absurdity of what he was saying. "What?" My voice cracked, the word barely audible. "What do you mean we can't be together? We're supposed to get married in 3 months, Nathan. What are you even talking about?" He avoided my gaze, looking anywhere but at me. The floor, the window, the clock ticking on the wall. I wanted to scream at him to look at me, to say this to my face, but instead he whispered, "It's not because of my mother. It's better this way." The lie was so transparent, so pathetic, it felt like a slap across my face. My chest tightened as I forced myself to laugh, a bitter, hollow sound that made his shoulders flinch. Better for who, Nathan? For you? For me? Or for her? He finally looked at me then, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite decipher. Guilt? Fear? Regret? "Rosanna, don't what?" I interrupted, standing up so quickly that the chair I'd been sitting on screeched against the hardwood floor. "Don't bring up the fact that your mother has been trying to ruin our relationship since day one? That she spent the past 2 years treating me like I'm some gold-digging parasite? Is that what I shouldn't bring up, Nathan?" His silence was deafening. The anger bubbling inside me was only outweighed by the ache that had already settled in my heart. I wanted to lash out, to break something, to force him to fight back. But he didn't. He just stood there, looking at me like a wounded animal. And that was worse than any argument could have been. "Do you even love me?" The words spilled out before I could stop them, my voice cracking under the weight of my own desperation. Or was it always her voice in your head, telling you I wasn't good enough? Nathan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence stretched on, suffocating me. I took a shaky step back, crossing my arms over my chest like it would somehow shield me from the pain that was crashing over me in waves. "You're pathetic!" I spat, my voice trembling with fury and heartbreak. "You don't even have the guts to stand up to her, to fight for what we had. You're letting her destroy us, Nathan. Don't you see that?" "I'm sorry." His voice was barely a whisper, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a tear glisten in his eye. I didn't want it to end like this. "Then why are you ending it?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Why are you letting her win?" He didn't answer. He just turned and walked toward the door, his shoulders slumped like a man defeated. And then, just as he reached for the doorknob, he paused. "Rosanna," he said softly, his back still turned to me. She told me about the deal." "What deal?" I asked sharply, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Nathan hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. She told me you were only with me for the money, that you agreed to marry me so you could get your family out of debt." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The room spun around me as his words sunk in. "You can't honestly believe that," I said, my voice trembling with disbelief. "You know me better than that, Nathan. You know that's not true." "She had proof," he said quietly, finally turning to face me. His expression was pained, as if he didn't even believe the words coming out of his own mouth. "Bank transfers, conversations, she showed me everything." My heart shattered into a million pieces as I realized what had happened. She'd fabricated everything. She'd spun a web of lies so intricate, so convincing, that even Nathan, the man who was supposed to know me better than anyone, had fallen for it. "You're a coward," I whispered, my voice breaking. "You're choosing to believe her lies because it's easier than fighting for the truth." "Rosanna, get out!" My voice was ice cold, and for the first time, he looked genuinely startled. "Get out of my apartment. Get out of my life. And when you finally realize what you've done, don't bother coming back." He hesitated, as if he wanted to say something else, but the look in my eyes must have stopped him. Without another word, he opened the door and walked out, leaving me standing there, shattered and alone. The tears didn't come right away. I was too angry, too numb. But as the minutes turned into hours, and the weight of what had just happened finally settled over me, I sank to the floor and wept. Not just for what I'd lost, but for the realization that the man I thought I loved had never really been mine to begin with. They say the beginning of love is like a dream. A hazy, golden blur of stolen glances, nervous smiles, and a spark that makes the world feel new. That's exactly what it was like with Nathan. A dream I never wanted to wake from. I met him on a rainy afternoon, the kind where the world seems a little quieter, the streets glistening with reflections of gray clouds. I ducked into a small cafe to escape the downpour, and there he was, sitting by the window with a book in his hands. His hair was slightly messy, his shirt sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal his forearms, and he had this boyish smile as he caught me shaking raindrops out of my hair. "You know, they say it's good luck to get caught in the rain," he said, his voice warm and smooth like the coffee I was about to order. "And who aren't they exactly?" I'd replied with a teasing smirk, my cheeks flushing slightly under his gaze. He laughed, a soft, genuine sound that somehow melted the chill from the storm outside, and offered me the seat across from him. We talked for hours that day, about books, about music, about the silly things that make you feel like you've known someone for years instead of minutes. By the time the rain stopped, I didn't want to leave. Neither did he. Nathan had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. He listened. Not the kind of listening where you're just waiting for your turn to speak, but the kind that makes you feel seen, heard, and understood. I think that's what drew me to him the most. Our first date was as perfect as any movie scene. He took me to an outdoor film screening of Breakfast at Tiffany's. We sat on a picnic blanket under a sky full of stars, sharing a box of chocolate truffles he'd brought because, as he said, every date should have a little sweetness. I remember how he looked at me that night, his eyes soft and full of wonder, as though I were the most magical thing he'd ever seen. When the credits rolled, he held my hand for the first time, and I swear, in that moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. Nathan wasn't just romantic. He was thoughtful in ways that made my heart ache. He remembered the little things, how I liked my coffee, the name of the flower shop I loved, even the song I couldn't stop humming under my breath. On my birthday, he surprised me with a first edition copy of a book I'd casually mentioned once during our first conversation at the cafe. When I asked him how he even remembered, he just smiled and said, "How could I forget? Everything about you matters." As the months turned into years, our love grew in ways I didn't think were possible. We became inseparable, two halves of a whole. Lazy Sundays were spent cooking breakfast together, dancing barefoot in the kitchen to old vinyl records. On weekdays, he'd leave little notes in my bag, tiny scraps of paper that read things like "thinking of you" or "can't wait to see your smile later." Even the mundane moments felt special with him, like grocery shopping or arguing over which movie to watch on a Friday night. And then, there was the night he asked me to marry him. It was spring, and the cherry blossoms were in full bloom. Nathan had planned a picnic in the park, just the two of us under a canopy of pink petals. I didn't think much of it at first. He was always planning sweet surprises. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of gold and lavender, he reached into the picnic basket and pulled out a small box. "Rosanna," he began, his voice trembling ever so slightly, "you've made my life brighter in ways I never thought possible. You've shown me what it means to love and to be loved. I can't imagine a future without you in it." He knelt down on one knee, holding the box out to me. Inside was a ring, simple yet elegant, with a small sapphire that caught the fading sunlight. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his eyes searching mine with a mix of hope and vulnerability. I remember how my hands flew to my mouth, tears spilling down my cheeks as I nodded furiously. "Yes," I whispered, then louder, "Yes, of course." He slipped the ring onto my finger, his hands shaking as much as mine. Then he pulled me into his arms, and we laughed and cried and kissed under the falling petals. It felt like a scene from a fairy tale, too perfect to be real. For months after, I couldn't stop staring at the ring on my finger. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a promise that we would face the world together, no matter what. I thought we were unbreakable, that nothing could ever come between us. But now, as I sit here in the same apartment we once decorated together, staring at the empty space where his jacket used to hang, I wonder how I could have been so naive. How could something that felt so pure, so unshakable, crumble under the weight of someone else's hatred? Looking back, I can see the warning signs now, the subtle ways his mother would undermine me, the tension in his voice when he talked about her. But back then, I ignored them. I was so caught up in the beauty of what we had that I refused to believe anything could tear us apart. And yet, here I am, alone. It started with small, almost imperceptible things. Little comments, subtle looks, gestures so fleeting that I sometimes questioned whether I was imagining them. At first, I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking, that Nathan's mother was just reserved. After all, no one warms up to someone new right away, right? But deep down, I knew. From the very first moment I met her, there was something in her eyes, a cold, calculating distance that never softened, no matter how hard I tried. The first time Nathan introduced me to her, I was so nervous my hands were shaking. I remember clinging to his arm as we stood on the porch of her immaculate house, the kind of place that looked more like a museum than a home. When she opened the door, she looked me up and down, her lips curving into a polite but distant smile. "So you're Rosanna," she said, her tone neutral, almost bored. "Nathan has told me quite a bit about you." Her words didn't seem off at first, but there was something about the way she said "quite a bit" that made my stomach twist. Still, I smiled, determined to make a good impression. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Caldwell," I said, holding out my hand. She glanced at it for a second too long before finally shaking it, her grip firm but not warm. "Please, call me Margaret," she replied, though the way she said it made me feel like I never should. The evening went about as well as you'd expect. Margaret was polite, yes, but her politeness felt like armor, cold and impenetrable. She asked me questions about my work, my family, my upbringing, but there was something in her tone that made it clear she wasn't curious. She was assessing me, judging me. When I told her about my job, she raised an eyebrow and said, "Oh, how interesting." When I mentioned my family, she nodded, but quickly steered the conversation back to Nathan. And when I tried to share something personal, a story or an opinion, she would smile that tight, thin-lipped smile of hers and change the subject entirely. I brushed it off at first. She was just protective, I told myself. Maybe even a little jealous. Nathan was her only child, after all, and I was the first serious girlfriend he'd brought home. It was natural for her to feel hesitant, but as time went on, her hesitation turned into something far more insidious. It started with small, seemingly harmless comments. "Rosanna, dear, don't you think that dress is a bit bold for dinner?" Or, "I'm sure Nathan didn't mean to forget your anniversary. He's just been so busy with work lately." They were always framed as helpful observations, but I could feel the sting of them beneath the surface. She was planting seeds of doubt, one by one, hoping they would take root. Nathan, of course, never noticed. "That's just how she is," he would say with a shrug whenever I brought it up. "She doesn't mean anything by it." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that her words were just a misunderstanding, that I was reading too much into things. But then came the more overt interference. One evening, Nathan and I were planning a weekend getaway to celebrate our anniversary. It was nothing fancy, just a cozy cabin in the mountains where we could unplug and spend time together. I was so excited. I'd even found the perfect place and booked it. But when I told Nathan about it, he hesitated. "I don't know if I can go," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Mom mentioned she needs help with some things this weekend." "Can't she ask someone else?" I asked, trying to hide my disappointment. "We've had this planned for weeks." "She's just been really stressed lately," he replied, avoiding my gaze. "You know how she gets." I didn't say anything, but inside I was seething. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Every time Nathan and I made plans, Margaret seemed to come up with a reason to derail them, and every time he chose her over me. Still, I tried to be understanding. I told myself it wasn't his fault, that he was just trying to be a good son. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. It wasn't just about canceled plans anymore, it was about control. She was always there, lurking in the background of our relationship, pulling strings I couldn't see. Then came the day she stopped hiding her intentions altogether. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Nathan and I were sitting in her living room discussing wedding plans. I was showing him ideas for venues on my laptop when Margaret walked in, carrying a tray of tea. She set it down on the coffee table and sat across from us, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I've been thinking," she began, her tone calm but authoritative, "about the wedding." "What about it?" Nathan asked, glancing up from the screen. "Well," she said, tilting her head slightly, "I just think it's important to consider practicality. A big wedding might not be the best idea, given Rosanna's family's financial situation." The room went silent. My heart stopped. Nathan froze, his eyes darting between me and his mother. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice trembling. "Oh, don't take it the wrong way, dear," she replied, her smile as sharp as a knife. "I just mean that weddings can be expensive, and I wouldn't want you to feel overwhelmed." I looked at Nathan, expecting him to say something, to defend me. But he just sat there, staring at his hands like a scolded child. That was the moment I realized the truth. She didn't just dislike me, she wanted me gone. And Nathan, whether out of fear or loyalty or something else entirely, was letting her win. From that day on, things were never the same. Every conversation with Nathan felt strained. Every argument ended with him saying, "I'm just trying to keep the peace." But whose peace was he keeping? His mother's, or his own? The cracks in our relationship, once small and invisible, were now gaping chasms. And no matter how hard I tried to bridge them, Margaret was always there, widening the divide. From the moment I first met Nathan's mother, Margaret, I could feel an unspoken tension in the air. It wasn't something she said outright. No, she was far too refined for that. Instead, it was the way her eyes lingered on me, cold and assessing, as if she were inspecting something she didn't quite approve of. Her handshake was firm but fleeting, and the smile she gave me didn't reach her eyes. She didn't need to say anything for me to know. I wasn't the woman she had envisioned for her son. At first, I chalked it up to nerves. Maybe she was just protective, I told myself. Nathan was her only child, after all, and I could only imagine how difficult it must be to see your son bring someone new into his life. I tried my best to win her over. I brought her flowers when we visited, complimented her taste in decor, and even asked her for advice when Nathan and I planned dates. I wanted to show her that I wasn't a threat, that I loved her son as much as she did. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. Her disapproval started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a faint whisper in the background of our relationship. She would make comments here and there, always couched in politeness, but cutting nonetheless. "Rosanna, dear, have you ever considered taking a cooking class? Nathan loves homemade meals, and it's such a wonderful skill for a young woman to have." Or, "It's so impressive that you're working in marketing, but it must be such an unpredictable field. Nathan needs stability, you know." Nathan never seemed to notice the barbs hidden in her words. He would smile and laugh, oblivious to the tension that tightened my chest every time she spoke. "That's just how she is," he'd say when I brought it up. "She doesn't mean anything by it." I tried to believe him, to brush off her comments as harmless, but the truth was, they hurt. They planted tiny seeds of doubt in my mind, about myself, about our relationship, about whether I would ever truly fit into his world. Over time, Margaret's subtle jabs turned into more overt interference. She began inserting herself into every aspect of our lives, always under the guise of helping. When Nathan and I moved in together, she insisted on coming over to help us get settled. That day, she spent hours rearranging our furniture, critiquing my choice of decor, and even suggesting that Nathan should have a separate office space in case he needed a quiet place to think. "It's a lovely apartment," she said, as she stood in the middle of our living room, her arms crossed. "But don't you think it's a bit cramped? Nathan's always thrived in open spaces. I just worry this might not be the best environment for him." Her words stung, But Nathan only chuckled, giving her a quick hug. "It's fine, Mom," he said. "We love it here." I wanted to say something, to defend our choices, but I bit my tongue. I didn't want to cause a scene, and besides, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Margaret's opinion was the only one that mattered to her. The real cracks in our relationship began to show when we started planning our wedding. What should have been one of the happiest times of my life quickly turned into a battleground. Margaret offered to help with the arrangements, and at first I was grateful. She had experience with events, after all, and I thought her involvement might bring us closer. But her help soon turned into control. She criticized every decision we made. The venue we chose was too rustic, the menu was too modern, and my dream of having a small, intimate ceremony was inappropriate for a family as prominent as theirs. She even went so far as to contact the wedding planner behind my back, making changes to the guest list and insisting on adding people I had never even met. "I just want to make sure everything is perfect for you two," she said, with a smile that made my skin crawl. "You'll thank me later." I tried to involve Nathan in the discussions, hoping he would see what was happening and stand up for us. But every time I brought it up, he brushed me off. "She just wants what's best for us," he'd say. "She means well." But did she? Margaret's actions weren't about us. They were about control. She wanted to mold our wedding, and by extension, our lives, into something that suited her vision. And Nathan, whether out of loyalty, fear, or simply denial, let her. The worst moment came when Margaret suggested we sign a prenuptial agreement. She brought it up during a family dinner, her tone light and casual, as if she were suggesting a new recipe. "Nathan, I've been thinking," she said, setting down her wineglass. "It might be a good idea to have a prenup drawn up, just to protect everyone's interests, of course." I nearly dropped my fork. "A prenup?" I repeated, staring at her in disbelief. "Why would we need a prenup?" Margaret didn't even flinch. "Oh, it's nothing personal, dear. It's just a practical precaution. You know how these things can get complicated." Nathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between us. "Mom, we don't need a prenup," he said weakly. "Oh, Nathan," she replied with a gentle laugh. "You're so idealistic. It's not about mistrust. It's about being smart. You've worked so hard for everything you have. I just want to make sure you're protected." Her words felt like a slap in the face. She didn't trust me. She thought I was after Nathan's money, his status, his name. And worse, she was planting that same doubt in his mind. That night, I confronted Nathan. "Do you even see what she's doing?" I demanded, my voice trembling with anger. "She doesn't want us to be happy, Nathan. She wants to control you, to control us." "She's just trying to help," he said, his voice defensive. "She doesn't mean anything by it." "Stop saying that," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "She does mean it, Nathan. She's trying to tear us apart, and you're letting her." He looked at me then, his face a mix of guilt and frustration. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "She's my mother. I can't just cut her out of my life." "I'm not asking you to cut her out," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm asking you to stand up for us, to stand up for me." But he didn't. Or maybe he couldn't. And in that moment, I realized that Margaret wasn't just a problem we could solve. She was a wall between us, one that Nathan wasn't willing to tear down. And that wall was starting to feel insurmountable. The drive to the small town where I used to live felt like shedding a heavy coat after a storm. With every mile, I felt a little lighter, a little freer, as though the weight of the past few weeks was slowly being left behind on the winding road. My little cottage sat on the edge of the town, tucked away behind a grove of tall trees. It wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms and a cozy living room with a wood-burning fireplace, but it was mine. It had always been mine, a place I could call home even when the rest of the world felt uncertain. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the familiar sight of the ivy creeping up the stone walls and the porch swing swaying gently in the breeze. I hadn't been here in years, not since Nathan and I decided to move closer to the city. I'd let the house sit empty, thinking I'd outgrown it, thinking I'd never need it again. But now, it felt like a refuge, a sanctuary where I could finally breathe. The first few days were quiet. I spent my time unpacking boxes and dusting off old memories. There was something comforting about being surrounded by the familiar, the creak of the wooden floors, the faint smell of lavender from the sachets I'd left in the closets. And yet, there was a lingering ache in my chest, a shadow that I couldn't quite shake. My birthday was only a few days away, and the thought of spending it alone made me feel hollow. But then, in the middle of one of those quiet, reflective moments, an idea struck me, a small, rebellious spark of joy that I hadn't felt in weeks. For as long as I could remember, I had wanted a dog. Not just any dog, but a playful, loving companion who would fill my home with life and laughter. Nathan had always dismissed the idea, saying a dog was too much work, too messy, too inconvenient. And Margaret, of course, had been firmly against it. "Dogs are a nuisance," she'd said once, her tone dripping with disdain. "They're better suited for people who don't have more important responsibilities." Well, I didn't have to care about their opinions anymore, did I? For the first time in years, I could make a decision purely for myself, without worrying about what anyone else thought. And so, on the morning of my birthday, I got in my car and drove to a local animal shelter. The shelter was a small, cheerful place, filled with the sounds of barking and the soft chatter of volunteers. As I walked through the rows of kennels, my heart swelled at the sight of so many eager faces, each one wagging a tail or pressing a nose against the bars in the hope of being chosen. It was overwhelming, in the best possible way. And then I saw him. He was a little bundle of fluff, barely 3 months old, with floppy ears and the biggest, most soulful brown eyes I'd ever seen. He was sitting quietly in the corner of his kennel, watching me with a mix of curiosity and shyness. When I crouched down to get a closer look, his tail gave the tiniest wag, as though he wasn't quite sure if he could trust me yet. "Hi there," I whispered, reaching a hand through the bars. "What's your name?" The volunteer who'd been guiding me around smiled and said, "That's Max. He's a bit timid, but he warms up quickly once he feels safe." "Max," I repeated, testing the name on my tongue. It suited him perfectly. "Can I meet him?" The moment they brought Max into the little meet-and-greet room, my heart melted. He padded over to me cautiously, his tail wagging just a little faster now. When I held out my hand, he sniffed it, then licked my fingers. That was it. I was done for. An hour later, I was driving home with Max curled up on the passenger seat, his tiny body rising and falling with each breath. Every time I glanced over at him, I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a warmth I hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about Nathan or Margaret or the life I thought I'd lost. I was thinking about this little creature who had just become a part of my world. Back at the cottage, Max explored every corner of the house, his tail wagging furiously as he sniffed at the furniture and scampered across the rugs. Watching him, I couldn't help but laugh. A real, genuine laugh that surprised even me. That evening, as the sun set and the soft glow of the fireplace filled the room, Max curled up beside me on the couch. I stroked his fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his tiny heart against my palm. For the first time in weeks, the ache in my chest began to ease. "This is the start of something new," I whispered to him, my voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "You and me, Max, we're going to be okay." Over the next few days, Max became my constant companion. He followed me everywhere, his little paws clicking against the wooden floors as he chased me from room to room. We went for long walks in the woods behind the cottage, the crisp winter air biting at our cheeks as we crunched through the snow. At night, he'd curl up at the foot of my bed, his presence a quiet reassurance that I wasn't alone. With Max by my side, the shadows of the past began to fade. I stopped replaying old arguments in my head, stopped wondering what I could have done differently. Instead, I focused on the present, on the simple joy of throwing a ball for Max to chase, on the way his ears perked up when he heard my voice, on the pure, unfiltered love in his eyes every time he looked at me. Nathan and Margaret felt like distant memories, like characters from a story that no longer mattered. This was my life now, a life I was building on my own terms, one small, joyful moment at a time. And as I sat on the porch swing one morning, Max curled up in my lap, I realized something. I was happy. Truly, genuinely happy. For the first time in years, I was free. The days in my little cottage began to take on a steady rhythm. Mornings were for long walks with Max through the forest trails behind the house, afternoons for tending to the small garden I'd neglected for years, and evenings for curling up by the fire with a book, Max's head resting on my lap. Life had become simple, quiet, and oddly comforting. Max had a way of making even the most mundane tasks feel lighter. Whether it was folding laundry or washing dishes, he was always close by, wagging his tail or nudging me with his nose, as if to remind me that I wasn't alone. He became my shadow, my constant companion, and in a way, my little piece of joy in a world that had felt so heavy for so long. I didn't have many friends in the town, not anymore. The few acquaintances I'd had from years ago had either moved away or drifted apart. But I didn't mind. Max was company enough, and I'd grown used to my solitude. It was peaceful, even if a little lonely on occasion. It was on one of those quiet, unremarkable mornings that everything began to change. The sun was just peeking through the trees as Max and I set out for our usual walk through the park. The air was crisp, the kind of morning that makes you feel alive, with the faint smell of dew on the grass and the distant sound of birdsong. Max trotted ahead of me, his tail wagging as he sniffed at every bush and tree we passed. This had become our routine, and I found comfort in its predictability. As we rounded a bend in the path, Max suddenly perked up, his ears twitching. Before I could stop him, he darted forward, his leash tugging in my hand. "Max!" I called out, laughing as he bounded toward a small, fluffy golden retriever puppy that had appeared out of nowhere. The two dogs began circling each other, tails wagging furiously, as if they were old friends reunited. I was still catching up when a voice called out, deep and warm, "Cooper, be gentle!" I looked up and saw a man jogging toward us, his hair slightly disheveled and his smile easy. He had the kind of face that immediately made you feel at ease. Kind eyes, a sharp jawline softened by a hint of stubble, and an air of quiet confidence. He was holding a leash in one hand, though his dog had clearly decided it was optional. "Sorry about that," he said as he approached, his voice tinged with amusement. "Cooper's still learning the concept of personal space." I smiled, bending down to pat Cooper, who had already started sniffing Max's ears with curious enthusiasm. "No need to apologize," I said. "Max doesn't mind the company. He's usually the one pulling me around." The man chuckled, crouching down to untangle Cooper's leash from Max's. "Well, it looks like they've hit it off." He glanced up at me, his smile widening. "I'm Daniel, by the way, and this troublemaker here is Cooper." "Rosanna," I replied, meeting his gaze. "And this is Max, my partner in crime." "Nice to meet you, Rosanna," he said, standing up and brushing a hand through his hair. "I don't think I've seen you around here before. Are you new to town?" "Not exactly," I said, adjusting Max's leash. "I used to live here years ago. I just recently came back." There must have been something in my tone, because Daniel tilted his head slightly, a curious look flickering across his face. "Well, welcome back," he said after a moment. "I think Cooper just made his first official friend in town." I laughed, watching as the two dogs continued their playful dance. "Looks like Max has too." We stood there for a while, letting the dogs play as we talked. It started with small talk, how long Daniel had lived in the town, what brought me back. But there was an ease to the conversation that surprised me. He had a way of listening that felt genuine, as if he wasn't just waiting for his turn to speak. And his sense of humor was quick and disarming, making me laugh in a way I hadn't in weeks. "So, what made you decide on a dog?" Daniel asked at one point, glancing down at Max, who was now flopped on the ground with Cooper pawing at him. I hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Honestly, it was something I'd wanted for a long time but kept putting off. Max was my way of starting fresh. A little gift to myself." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that. Cooper came into my life during a rough patch, too. Funny how dogs have a way of making everything feel a little brighter, isn't it?" "Yeah," I said softly, watching Max's tail wag as he playfully nipped at Cooper. "They really do." Before we knew it, nearly an hour had passed. The dogs were sprawled out in the grass, thoroughly exhausted from their antics, and the sun had climbed higher in the sky. I glanced at my watch, surprised at how quickly the time had flown. I should probably get Max home, I said reluctantly. He'll sleep for the rest of the day after this. Daniel smiled, reaching down to scoop up Cooper's leash. Same here, but maybe we'll run into each other again? Same time tomorrow? I hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. Yeah, same time tomorrow. As Max and I walked back to the cottage, I couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a spark of something I hadn't dared to hope for: connection. It wasn't just about Daniel, though he was undeniably charming, but the simple joy of meeting someone new, of letting a little light into the quiet, closed-off corners of my world. That night, as Max snored softly at the foot of my bed, I found myself looking forward to tomorrow. To the park, to Cooper's floppy ears and wagging tail, and to the possibility of something new. That evening, as the golden light of the setting sun streamed through the windows of my little cottage, I found myself unable to focus on anything but the day's events. Max lay curled up at my feet, his soft snoring filling the silence, but my thoughts were far from peaceful. My mind was stuck on Daniel, his warm smile, his easy laugh, the way he seemed so genuine and kind. I should have been excited about meeting someone new. It wasn't every day that a random walk in the park led to an unexpected and pleasant conversation, but instead of feeling hopeful, I felt an all-too-familiar knot forming in my stomach, the kind of knot that reminded me of all the ways I'd been hurt before. I stared into the flickering flames of the fireplace, my hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea. My reflection in the window across the room caught my eye, and I almost didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. She seemed cautious, guarded, as if she were bracing for the worst, and I knew exactly why. I thought back to Nathan, to the way he had made me feel so special, so loved, until he didn't. I had believed in him, in us, and for a while, it felt like we had something unshakable. But Margaret's meddling, his inability to stand up for me, and the eventual betrayal had shattered that belief. It wasn't just my trust in him that had been broken. It was my trust in myself, in my ability to judge someone's character. What if Daniel wasn't as genuine as he seemed? What if all the warmth in his voice and the kindness in his eyes were just a mask? People could be so good at pretending. I'd learned that the hard way. I set my tea down and buried my face in my hands, trying to push the memories away. But they came rushing back with brutal clarity. Nathan's hesitation when I asked him to defend me, Margaret's cold, cutting remarks, the way he walked out of my apartment with nothing more than a half-hearted apology. I told myself that I was done with all of it, with relationships, with opening my heart to someone else. It was easier to be alone, to rely on myself and Max, to build a life that no one else could tear apart. And yet, here I was, considering the possibility of meeting Daniel again. "What's wrong with me?" I whispered, looking down at Max. His ears twitched, and he opened one eye to peer at me as if to say, "You're overthinking this." Maybe I was. After all, it wasn't like Daniel had asked for anything more than a friendly meeting at the park. He didn't seem pushy or insincere. He'd simply been nice, kind even. So why was I so afraid to let my guard down, even just a little? Because letting my guard down meant risking everything I'd worked so hard to rebuild. It meant opening the door to the possibility of pain, of disappointment, of another person walking away when things got hard. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that. But then I thought about the way Daniel had laughed when Cooper and Max tangled their leashes, or how he'd asked about my decision to get a dog with genuine curiosity instead of judgment. There hadn't been any hidden agenda in his words, no subtle hints that he thought less of me for the choices I'd made. For the first time in what felt like forever, I'd felt seen, not judged. And wasn't that what I wanted? To be seen? To connect with someone again, even if it was just for a brief moment? I sighed and leaned back against the couch, closing my eyes. The warmth of the fire, the softness of Max's fur under my fingertips, and the memory of Daniel's smile all swirled together in my mind. Maybe this didn't have to be anything more than it was, a chance to share a moment with someone kind. Maybe I didn't need to overthink it, to dissect every word and every possibility. What's the worst that could happen? I asked myself. If it didn't work out, if Daniel turned out to be someone I couldn't trust, I'd still have Max. I'd still have my little cottage, my garden, and the life I was building for myself. And if he wasn't? If he was just as kind and genuine as he seemed? Well, maybe I owed it to myself to find out. I glanced at Max, who had now fully opened his eyes and was staring up at me with that unshakable loyalty only a dog could offer. "What do you think?" I asked him softly. "Should I give it a shot?" His tail wagged, thumping against the floor in an almost rhythmic beat. I couldn't help but laugh. "You're right," I said, leaning down to scratch behind his ears. "I'm probably overthinking this." The decision felt oddly liberating, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. I wasn't committing to anything more than a walk in the park, a chance to let Max play with Cooper, and maybe share another conversation with Daniel. It didn't have to be anything more than that. As I climbed into bed that night, Max curled up beside me. I found myself looking forward to tomorrow. Not with the same cautious optimism I'd felt after my breakup, but with a quiet curiosity, a willingness to see where this path might lead. Maybe it was too soon to hope. Maybe I was setting myself up for heartbreak. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe this time would be different. The days began to pass with a new kind of rhythm, one that revolved around long walks in the park with Max, and more often than not, Daniel and Cooper. It wasn't planned exactly. We'd just fall into step with each other whenever we crossed paths. At first, it was casual, lighthearted, a friendly chat about the weather, the dog's antics, or something funny we'd seen on our walks. But before I knew it, those brief conversations turned into hours that seemed to slip by in the blink of an eye. Daniel was easy to talk to in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. He didn't interrupt or try to steer the conversation back to himself. Instead, he listened, genuinely listened, and responded with thoughtful, often funny insights that left me smiling long after we parted ways. He had this effortless warmth about him, like he'd seen enough of life to understand its complexities, but still chose to focus on its simple joys. One morning, as Max and Cooper chased each other across the open field, we found ourselves sitting on a bench near the pond, watching the ripples on the water. The sunlight danced across the surface, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely at peace. "You've been in town for a while now," Daniel said, leaning back on the bench. "Have you been able to settle back in?" I nodded, pulling my jacket tighter against the crisp breeze. "It's been nice. Quiet, but in a good way. I think I needed the space to just breathe." He glanced at me, his expression softening. "Sometimes that's all we need, to step back and find our footing again." "Yeah," I said quietly, staring at the water. "I didn't realize how much I missed it here. It feels like I'm rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten about." Daniel smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "Funny how coming back to a familiar place can do that. It's like the world slows down just enough for you to hear your own thoughts." I turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "You're surprisingly poetic for a guy chasing a hyperactive puppy around the park." He laughed, the sound rich and unguarded. "What can I say? Cooper brings out my philosophical side." We fell into an easy silence after that, watching the dogs tumble through the grass. I realized then how much I looked forward to these moments, these simple, unassuming conversations that felt as natural as breathing. It wasn't just the companionship. It was the connection, the sense that I could be myself without fear of judgment or pretense. As the days turned into weeks, our walks became a regular occurrence. Sometimes we'd talk about our lives, sharing bits and pieces of who we were. I learned that Daniel had moved to the town a couple of years ago, leaving behind a high-stress corporate job to start fresh. He'd always loved dogs, but hadn't had the time or space for one until recently, when he decided to adopt Cooper on a whim. "He's been a handful," Daniel admitted one day as Cooper tried, and failed, to sit still for more than a few seconds. "But he's also the best decision I've made in a long time. He keeps me grounded." I smiled, glancing down at Max, who was trotting beside me with his usual calm demeanor. I know the feeling. Max has been my rock these past few months. I don't know what I'd do without him. Daniel looked at me then, his expression thoughtful. "It's funny, isn't it? How these little creatures can make such a big impact on our lives." "They really can," I agreed, my voice soft. "They remind you what it means to just be in the moment. But it wasn't just the dogs that brought us closer. The more we talked, the more I realized how much we had in common. We both loved the outdoors, both enjoyed quiet mornings with coffee and a good book, and both had a weakness for terrible puns. Daniel had a way of making me laugh without even trying, his sense of humor quick and infectious. And when he laughed, really laughed, it felt like the kind of sound you wanted to bottle up and keep for rainy days. One day, as we walked along the forest trail, he asked me about my work. It was a simple question, but it caught me off guard. I hadn't talked about my career in weeks, not since leaving the city. I used to work in marketing, I said, kicking at a stray pebble on the path. It was fine, but I think I stayed in it longer than I should have. It didn't feel right anymore, you know? He nodded, his expression understanding. I get that. I felt the same way about my old job. It's hard to let go of something you've invested so much time in, even when you know it's not what you want. Exactly, I said, surprised at how easily he understood. But being here, doing something as simple as walking Max every day, it's helped me see things more clearly. I don't know what's next, but for the first time, I'm okay with not knowing. Daniel smiled, his gaze steady. Sometimes not knowing is the best place to be. It means anything's possible. As we walked back to the park entrance that day, I couldn't help but feel grateful. Not just for Max, or for the peace I'd found in the town, but for Daniel. He'd become a friend when I hadn't realized how much I needed one. And though the thought of letting someone new into my life still scared me, I couldn't deny that it also felt good. Maybe it wasn't about what would happen next. Maybe it was enough to just enjoy the moments as they came, one walk at a time. That night, I was curled up on the couch with Max, the soft glow of the fireplace flickering across the room. The day had been long but satisfying, filled with the simple pleasures I'd grown to cherish: an early walk in the woods, tending to the garden, and an evening spent reading. Just as I was about to head to bed, my phone buzzed on the coffee table, its screen lighting up with Daniel's name. A warm smile spread across my face as I picked up the call, but the moment I heard his voice, I knew something was off. "Rosanna," he started, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Hey, sorry to call so late. I hope I didn't wake you." "No, it's fine," I said, sitting up. "Is everything okay? You sound tense." There was a pause on the other end, the kind that made my heart skip a beat. Yes, everything's fine," he said quickly, though his voice betrayed his nerves. I was thinking, maybe we could meet tomorrow. In the park." "Of course," I replied, a little confused. "That's not unusual for us." "Right," he said, letting out a shaky laugh. "But, without the dogs this time. Just us, if that's okay." His words hung in the air for a moment, and I felt a flutter in my chest. This wasn't like Daniel. He was always so calm, so steady. Whatever was on his mind, it was clearly important. "All right," I said softly. "What time?" 10, he suggested, and when I agreed, I could almost hear him exhale in relief. "Great. Thanks, Rosanna. I'll see you tomorrow." The call ended, leaving me staring at the phone in my hand, my thoughts racing. Something about the way he'd sounded, nervous, almost vulnerable, made my heart ache. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he wanted to tell me was going to change things between us. The next morning, I arrived at the park a few minutes early. The air was crisp and cool, the first hints of autumn creeping into the breeze. I paced near our usual spot, trying to calm the nerves that had crept up on me overnight. When I finally spotted Daniel walking toward me, I stopped in my tracks. He was holding a small bouquet of wildflowers, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the shy smile on his face. As he got closer, I noticed the faint pink tint on his cheeks, and my heart skipped a beat. "Hey," he said, holding out the flowers. "These are for you." I blinked, caught off guard, before a smile spread across my face. "Thank you," I said, taking the bouquet. "They're beautiful." "You're welcome," he said, shoving his hands into his pockets as if unsure what to do with them. "I wasn't sure if you liked flowers, but I don't know, I just thought you might." I laughed softly, the sound easing some of the tension in the air. "I love them," I assured him, holding the bouquet close. Really. We began walking along the familiar path, but something about the atmosphere felt different. There was a quiet intensity in the way Daniel looked at me, a vulnerability that made my heart ache. For the first time, it felt like there was something unspoken between us, something that neither of us had dared to acknowledge, until now. Finally, as we reached a quiet spot by the pond, Daniel stopped and turned to face me. His expression was a mix of determination and uncertainty, as though he'd rehearsed what he was about to say 100 times, but still wasn't sure it would come out right. "Rosanna," he began, his voice soft but steady. "I've been wanting to tell you something for a while now. I didn't know how." I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my stomach flutter. "I like you," he said finally, his words rushing out all at once. "I mean, more than just as a friend. I didn't expect this to happen, but the more time I spend with you, the more I realize how much I care about you." I stared at him, my mind racing. His honesty, his vulnerability, it was so different from anything I'd experienced before. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit. I felt the same way. "I care about you too," I said softly, my voice trembling. "More than I expected to." The relief on his face was immediate, his smile spreading wide and genuine. "You do?" I nodded, feeling my own smile tugging at my lips. "I do." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of laughter and quiet conversation. The weight of unspoken feelings finally lifted. By the time we parted ways, I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could find happiness again. But that night, as I was drifting off to sleep, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it made my stomach twist. Groggily, I answered, my voice thick with sleep. "Hello? Rosanna?" Came a voice I hadn't heard in weeks, but would recognize anywhere. My breath caught in my throat. It was Margaret, Nathan's mother. "Margaret," I said, sitting up in bed. "Why are you calling me?" "Oh, don't act so surprised," she said, her tone sharp and condescending. "I just wanted to check in, to see how you're doing after, well, everything." I clenched my jaw, gripping the phone tightly. "What do you want?" She laughed, the sound cold and cruel. "I just find it amusing that you think you can move on so easily, as if you could ever find someone better than my Nathan." "Margaret," I said through gritted teeth, my voice trembling with anger. "I don't have time for this." "You were never good enough for him," she continued, her words like venom. "I warned him about you, and I was right. You're nothing without him." Something inside me snapped. "Enough," I said firmly, cutting her off. "You don't get to talk to me like this. Not anymore. Nathan made his choice, and so did I. And for the record, I'm doing just fine without either of you." There was a stunned silence on the other end, and for once, Margaret seemed at a loss for words. "Goodbye, Margaret," I said, my voice steady. "Don't call me again." With that, I ended the call and immediately blocked the number. My hands were shaking, but as I set the phone back on the nightstand, I felt a sense of power I hadn't felt in years. Margaret's words couldn't hurt me anymore. Her control, her manipulation, it was all in the past. I looked down at Max, who had stirred awake and was now watching me with concern. Smiling, I reached down to stroke his fur. "It's okay," I whispered. "We're okay." And for the first time in a long time, I truly believed it. The days that followed Margaret's call were a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt shaken, as if her words had reopened an old wound I thought had healed. But another part of me, stronger, steadier, felt an undeniable sense of triumph. I had stood my ground. I had faced the person who had caused me so much pain and told her, without hesitation, that she no longer had any power over me. It was a kind of freedom I hadn't known I needed, and it left me feeling lighter than I had in years. Daniel noticed the change in me almost immediately. On our next walk together, he gave me a curious look as we strolled through the park, Cooper and Max trotting ahead of us. "You seem different today," he said, his tone gentle but perceptive. lighter somehow. Did something happen? I smiled, glancing at him. You could say that. Let's just say I finally put some ghosts to rest. He didn't press me for details, and I appreciated that about him. Instead, he reached out and took my hand, his touch warm and grounding. I'm glad, he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made my heart ache in the best possible way. The next few weeks felt like a dream. Daniel and I spent more and more time together, our connection deepening with every conversation, every shared moment. We started meeting outside the park, coffee dates at the little cafe by the town square, movie nights at his place where Cooper and Max inevitably ended up stealing all the snacks, and even quiet evenings at my cottage where we cooked together and talked about everything and nothing. With Daniel, everything felt easy. There was no pressure, no fear of judgment. He saw me for who I was, flaws and all, and still chose to stay. And I, in turn, found myself letting go of the walls I'd built around my heart. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that love didn't have to be complicated or painful. It could be kind. It could be safe. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves painted the world in shades of gold and crimson, Daniel surprised me with a picnic. He showed up at my door with a basket in one hand and a mischievous grin on his face. Care to join me for an adventure? He asked, holding out his other hand. I laughed, grabbing my coat. How could I say no to that face? He led me to a secluded spot in the park where the trees formed a natural canopy and the sunlight filtered through the leaves in soft golden beams. We spread out a blanket, and he unpacked an assortment of my favorite things: fresh pastries, a thermos of hot chocolate, and even a small bouquet of wildflowers. As we ate and talked, I couldn't help but marvel at how far I'd come. Sitting there with Daniel, watching Max and Cooper chase each other through the fallen leaves, I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't thought possible. At one point, Daniel turned to me, his expression serious but soft. Rosanna, he began, taking my hand in his, I just want you to know. You've made my life better in ways I didn't even know I needed. You've brought light into places I didn't even realize were dark. My throat tightened, and for a moment I couldn't speak. You've done the same for me, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. You've shown me that it's okay to let someone in again, that it's okay to trust. He smiled, his thumb brushing lightly against my hand. Then I'd say we make a pretty good team. I laughed, feeling a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the hot chocolate. Yeah, I'd say we do. That night, as I sat by the fireplace with Max curled up at my feet, I thought about the life I had rebuilt. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, still scars from the past that hadn't completely faded. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. I had found a love that felt real and steady, built on mutual respect and kindness. I had found a partner who didn't try to change me, but instead celebrated me for who I was. And most importantly, I had found myself again. Months later, on a sunny spring afternoon, Daniel and I stood in the garden of my little cottage, surrounded by friends and neighbors. Max and Cooper trotted happily around the yard, their tails wagging as if they could sense the joy in the air. Daniel turned to me, a soft smile on his face as he held my hands. Rosanna, he said, his voice steady and filled with emotion. You're my best friend, my partner, my everything. I promise to stand by your side, to support you, and to cherish every moment we have together. Tears welled in my eyes as I smiled back at him. Daniel, you've shown me what it means to be loved unconditionally. You've brought joy and light into my life when I thought I'd lost them forever. I promise to walk this journey with you, hand in hand, no matter where it takes us. As we exchanged vows, surrounded by the people and dogs that had become our family, I felt a profound sense of peace. This was my new beginning, a life filled with love, laughter, and the promise of endless possibilities. And as Daniel leaned in to kiss me, the sound of Max and Cooper barking happily in the background, I knew with absolute certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be.